Rarely does a church dinner result in people crying. And when one does, it's usually because something has gone horribly wrong. A ruined main entree that brings kitchen volunteers to their wits' end, or a less than well thought out comment that hits a sensitive nerve. In October 2009, however, tears flowed at a church dinner in the small rural town of Storrs, Connecticut, because something had gone terribly right, or in fact, many things. Patty was one of those crying that night. The reason for her tears was simple. She could actually be there at this dinner. They were tears of sheer joy. You see, even though that she had been a member of that church since sometime in the 1950s or 60s, and a fairly active one at that, that autumn night in 2009 was the first time she'd actually been able to take part in an all-church dinner there in probably a decade or more. You see, for Patty, as advancing age had taken away mobility and added on clunky mobility aids, navigating the 2 full flights of stairs necessary to get up to the second floor auditorium where such events took place, it just wasn't a happening thing anymore for her. Just as it had never been for others, even ones of younger ages who were users of wheelchairs, for example. You see, the church buildings in Storrs, first constructed in the mid-1920s and added onto in the 50s, it had no elevator. Right or wrong, accessibility concerns simply weren't on people's minds in that era. Not only was there no elevator, the buildings were a maze with different wings of the building having different floor heights and steps and stairs everywhere. There were no washrooms meeting accessibility standards, and there were no washrooms at all on that second floor where the auditorium was that could accommodate large events. So even if someone who was only more moderately mobility challenged mustered up the effort to get up there, better hope they didn't need to pee. But now, as of that October weekend, some 13 years ago, a brand new elevator had lifted Patty and many others up, lifted them up literally, physically, to that church dinner, and lifted them up as people fully welcomed, included, and embraced within the community of God's people in that place. A new hallway linked the formerly disconnected second floors of the 2 different wings of the building. A number of new washrooms and building entranceway modifications helped open the doors even more widely to welcome all. And there was even a new front office that was actually located at the entrance that people came into the building, rather than buried back in some dark corner of the building. As I said, a whole lot of things had to have gone right along the way to bring about the tears of joy from Patty and others that night. Perhaps the most important one was the vote that was taken by the whole congregation just 12 months earlier in October of 2008 to authorize a capital campaign for 3 years for the $1.1 million that it would take to make all the rest of it happen. Now just think about that. October 2008. For any of you who follow the world of finance at all, or even just have a general sense of your own personal economics, perhaps the year 2008, and especially the autumn of that year, will ring a bell. Driven by the subprime mortgage crisis in the US, the whole economy was in a downward spiral. On September 29th, the stock market crashed in the largest single-day drop in the Dow Jones history up to that point. October 2008 wasn't exactly the right moment to be doing much of anything remotely risky financially, let alone trying to raise $1.1 million from within an aging and slowly shrinking congregation in a small town, mainly populated by retirees and university professors and state government employees and hobby farmers and service workers. In the few weeks right before they took that vote, many of them probably had thousands, if not tens of thousands, disappear from the personal savings that they held in investment accounts. And yet, in less than 3 months, by the end of the following January, $850,000 had already been pledged. The go-ahead was given to start construction, and the tears of joy flowed at a church dinner some 9 months later. Praise be to God. And just to be clear, because I know some of you recognize that I'm talking about the congregation that I served for 10 years prior to coming here, all of this took place before I even knew about them. This was all them and God. I can take no credit. I've been thinking about Patty's tears and the congregation's vote that led to them. I've been thinking about them because of how seemingly out of place this all was, as I've said. Setting out to raise that kind of money right as the world was in the throes of the most severe recession and worst economic crisis since the Great Depression? Not exactly the most natural or obvious seeming thing to do. The words of promise and joy and abundance and redemption that we have heard today from the book of the prophet Isaiah also were not the most obvious seeming thing for the prophet to proclaim in his time. The prophet's proclamation was, you could say, very out of place. After all, the situation for our ancient ancestors, some 600 years or so before Christ, the situation was not looking promising. The people of whom God had set apart to be a holy people, following in God's ways of mercy and justice, a light to the nations, blessed to be a blessing, well, by this point in their history, they were anything but. The poor and needy in their midst were being trampled by the rich and comfortable. What do you mean by crushing my people, by grinding the face of the poor? Asked God through the voice of Isaiah. All the while, the northern kingdom of Israel had already been taken over and scattered by a neighboring empire generations earlier. Conquering armies were already quickly advancing upon Judah, the southern kingdom, the remnant that remained centered around Jerusalem, where Isaiah wrote from. Through most of the 34 chapters that precede the passage we've heard this morning, Isaiah proclaims God's word of judgment and of warning against the nation. What you are doing right now is not okay for my people, God says to them, and you'd better shape up. And since I know you're not going to shape up, here's what's going to happen. Chapter upon chapter speak of ruin and desolation, of a coming day of tumult and trampling and confusion, a battering down of walls and a cry for help from the mountains, to the mountains. Both God and the prophet are equal opportunity proclaimers, so there are oracles against many of the other neighboring nations as well. But as God's chosen ones, the harshest warnings and judgments come for Zion, that is to say, for Jerusalem and for the Judean nation centered around it. And then, in the midst of all of these dire warnings and somber judgments, these words of desolation and predictions of destruction, comes what we've heard this morning. The wilderness and the dry land shall be glad. The desert shall rejoice and blossom. A word to those of anxious heart, be strong, do not fear. Eyes opened, ears unstopped, leaping, dancing, singing, waters in the desert, peace among the creatures. It's a wonderful vision and promise of joy, and yet one that seems so out of place. It seemed out of place in the middle of all of Isaiah's dire warnings. It seemed out of place in the face of all the mounting evidence all around them about what was in store. And indeed, Judah and Jerusalem did get conquered in the year 587 BC, with many of the people hauled off to exile in Babylon. Moreover, though, this vision and this promise of joy, it might even seem out of place for us as we now hear it, these 2,600 or so years later. After all, streams in the desert and the blossoming of the wilderness sound a bit far-fetched in the face of the climate catastrophe that we 20th and 21st century humans seem hell-bent on inflicting upon ourselves. And the people of God being saved from ravenous beasts seems like just a lofty dream in contrast to the news that comes out of Ukraine and other places of violence and conflict around our world. Even the promise of joy itself, yes, this is supposed to be the cheerful holiday season, but joy itself might very well feel unreachable in the midst of health challenges or tight finances or family tensions. But here's the thing, my friends. Perhaps the whole point of this, perhaps the whole point of the proclamation that we hear is, in fact, how out of place it all seems. Perhaps we are being invited to recognize the truth that even in the out of place places, God is still there with us and is still coming to embrace and restore and save us. As the pastor and highly regarded biblical scholar Walter Brueggemann puts it, this passage invites us out of our managed rationality to affirm that God does what the world thinks is not possible. It invites us out of our managed rationality. Talk about a United Church characteristic, managed rationality, to affirm that God does what the world thinks is not possible. That, my friends, is the deeper joy that Jesus brings, not the shiny lights and ringing bells of holiday cheer, but a deeper joy. Sure, we might rightly wonder when the world itself is going to turn. But in the meantime, the world is already turning. Each and every time the ways of the world do not win out against the weak and the vulnerable. Sure, not all of the lame have we seen walk, but we have seen some. And that's the world already turning. Not all of the poor have had their burden released, but some have. And each and every time even one person does, that's the kingdom already breaking in against the powers that be of our world. That's ultimately what Christmas itself is all about, is it not? God breaking down the barrier between the heavens and the earth, the divine becoming like us, so that we might become like the divine. Now, I will confess to you that I don't always know what will make for joy, or what I or any of us can do to try to create joy. But when it pokes through, even in the most out-of-place places, spoken from the unlikeliest of voices, I know that it is a thing of God's love on the way. As the poet Mary Oliver reminds us, if you suddenly and unexpectedly feel joy, don't hesitate. Give in to it. There are plenty of lives and whole towns destroyed or about to be. We are not wise and not very often kind, and much can never be redeemed. Still, life has some possibility left. Perhaps this is its way of fighting back. That sometimes something happens better than all the riches or power in the world. It could be anything. But very likely you notice it in the instant when love begins. Anyway, that's often the case. Anyway, whatever it is, don't be afraid of its plenty. Joy is not made to be a crumb. Blessing and honor, glory and power be unto God, now and forever. Amen.